Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Jeff Mazziata. Welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. So myself, I'm the activities coordinator at YCAPS, and I'm stepping in today for our usual host and program director of the series, Amani Kidd, who's behind the scenes today, as we have been doing recently. Along with us, we also joined today by Professor Hilary Holbrow, who will be presenting on gender roles in Japan. A little bit about our speaker today. Uh, Hilary Holbrow is an assistant professor at Indiana University, where she researches and teaches on Japanese society with a focus on work and the economy, immigration, and gender. Her book, The Future is Foreign: Women and Immigrants in Corporate Japan, examines how employment patterns are shifting as Japan's population ages. I think for all of us, we're constantly thinking about that. So she's also lived in Tokyo, Yokohama, Okinawa, and Kyoto. So she's got a wide breadth of experience in and around all sorts of Japan, so she can tell you how it is everywhere. One final note is a kind reminder to everyone to refrain from turning on your microphones during the duration of today's recording and presentation. We want to avoid any hot mic issues that we may encounter, and so that way we can hear our speaker clearly. And also, I might say that the chat is open. So if you did have any questions that jumped into your mind while our speaker is talking, feel free to put them into the chat box. And then myself and Amani will pull these out of the chat box, and then we'll be getting to those later in the Q&A session. That being said, our speaker will talk for around 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to have a similar amount of time for Q&A. I'll pass it over to our speaker to get started, and thank you so much, everyone, for your time this morning and this evening, depending on where you are in the world.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome. I'm Hilary Holbrow, zooming in from Indiana University. So I know it's morning for you, but it's evening for me. And I actually recently returned from Europe. So not only is it evening, it's like 3 in the morning. But I am fired up and ready to give this talk. So thank you for being here. And I will be speaking to you a bit about gender roles in Japan. So this is a topic that you can see from this photograph that I don't just have an academic interest in. I lived in Japan for some years. My oldest son, who I have in the baby carrier there in the photo, was born in Tokyo. And as it happened, our neighbors who are pictured next to us in this photo also had a baby within a week of us. So that was a really fun experience, kind of having these young children together in Tokyo. And so part of my sort of interest in Japanese society, Japanese families, and gender roles comes from just like watching the families that I've been friends with in Japan over many years and kind of how their lives are unfolding and changing with the backdrop of some of the demographic trends that I'm going to be talking about later today. So I want you to pay attention in this picture to this little guy here in the left-hand corner of the screen, because I did get together with these people last time I was in Tokyo, and that little guy is now here, almost as tall as I am, in the back of the photo. And here's some other members of the family. So these are my good friends, and I view family and gender roles not just through the lens of statistics, but also, like I said, through their lives and how they're unfolding. So I think in terms of gender roles in Japan, broadly speaking, one topic that has received a lot of coverage in recent months is, of course, the selection of Sanae Takaichi to be Japan's first woman prime minister. So this has received a lot of attention, but if you're just reading English language media about gender roles in Japan, pretty much all the headlines are like this, right? They're like, gender roles are deeply entrenched. Japan struggles to get more female leaders. Japan has an appalling record on gender equality. The gender gap persists in politics. Gender roles are particularly rigid in rural Japan, and so on. So we just kind of get this impression from the English language media of Japan being kind of behind, in quotes, for having really sort of problematic gender relations. And one thing that my students often say exposed to this media coverage is they say, oh, well, Japan is more traditional in terms of how it gender roles operate there than the United States. And one point that I'm going to make today is that that's kind of a misperception. So when my students, at least, when they're talking about traditional gender roles, this is usually what they have in mind, right? There's men who go and work outside the home, in an office, maybe in a factory or something like that. And the women are responsible for the household. They're doing the shopping, they're doing the cleaning, and they're doing the child rearing. So there's these two very distinct gender roles that involve, women being responsible for household stuff and men being responsible for earning the money. But I think what most people don't realize when they call this traditional gender roles is that this is actually a gender division of labor that only emerged within the past couple hundred years anywhere, and even more recently in Japan. So to show you some statistics, here we're looking at Japanese women's labor force participation by age at some quite historical data. So we have here on the x-axis, there's the age group that we're talking about, and then the percentage of those women in different decades who are doing some sort of economic production. And if we look at 1880, we can see that actually throughout the life course, almost all Japanese women are working, right? And that kind of declines with the decades as industrialization advances in Japan. And this is not a phenomenon that is unique to Japan. This is true in England. This is true in the United States. This is true in every industrialized country. But what varies is the timing with which this transition occurred. So, in 1880, when women are working, what are they doing? Well, they're doing agricultural work, which is the same work that men are doing. So for the most part, women and men are actually working side by side in agricultural production. And this of course doesn't mean that men and women are doing the exact same things, but they are both engaged in economic production, and there's not this kind of strong separation of gender roles that emerges later on in the industrialization process. So who's taking care of kids? Well, in Japan's case, it was mostly other children. So older children cared for younger children, and that was kind of a gender neutral phenomenon. Girls did this as well as boys. So basically, as soon as children were done nursing, they were handed off to the older children because when you're farming in this sort of low technology way, it's really an all hands on deck enterprise, and you simply can't spare adult women's labor in the way that happens later on in industrialization. So this idea that there's separate gender roles, men go out to work, women take care of the household, this really only becomes the dominant model in 1950s Japan. And that's because to have this model, you have to have a workplace that is separated physically from the home. And so typically that happens when agriculture declines and people who are employed by someone else increase. So you can see this in, once again, Japanese historical employment statistics. If we go back to 1920 or 1930, the majority of the workforce is still self-employed in agriculture in Japan at that time. And the number of people who are employed by others is rather low. Now, particularly, so Japan is of course industrializing throughout the late 1800s, early 1900s, but we can see here that the number of employees, people who are employed by others rather than self-employed, it only becomes the majority in 1960. And in 1950, it's still fairly evenly balanced with self-employment. Now, when you're self-employed, whether that's agriculture or some other type of business, often you're doing that out of the home. So that means that both men and women end up engaging in different types of household labor. And you really only get the separation of gender roles, women in the household, men outside of it, when most people become employees. So we have this picture here saying in the 1955 system, being a housewife was a dream of many women. Well, why was this a dream? Because this is a lot easier than kind of subsistence agricultural farming. And so the period in time when this became the sort of dominant model for Japan was the 1950s and 1960s. We can also see this reflected in, once again, a women's labor force participation and how different this looks in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s compared to the statistics that I showed you earlier from the 1880s. So we can see that in this post-war period, a fairly sizable number of women enter the labor force when they're in their teens or 20s. Then they drop out. Not everyone, but many of them drop out during the childbearing years, and then they re-enter. And even in the 1950s, this pattern was kind of less entrenched than it became in the 1960s and 70s, as we saw in the earlier slide. Sort of the percentage of the Japanese population that was no longer in agriculture and that was employed in some other form of work increased. All right. So what was going on while this industrial transition was occurring? One thing was that Japan's birth rate was falling precipitously. So this is showing us the birth rate from 1947 up to 2023. And we can see that in the early post-war period, in the late 1940s, birth rates in Japan were very high. Over 4 children per woman. And then in the 1950s, while industrialization was advancing very rapidly, that just plummets. It plummets very quickly. And then there's kind of a low level of fertility since that time, falling below replacement rates of 2.1 children per woman in the early 1970s, and remaining at a low level and indeed falling even further since then. There is just one anomalous year that I will point out here, which is 1966. I'm sure some members of the audience know why this is, that there's this one year with very low fertility, but that's because in the Chinese zodiac, there's a 60-year cycle of, we all know there's like year of the pig, year of the horse, so on. And this is combined with a 5-year cycle of elements where you get, water, snake, fire, horse, and so on. And 1966 happens to be the year of the fire horse. And this is a year that people traditionally believed women born in that year were very stubborn and aggressive and sort of unmanageable. And there's so many people considered this to be problematic that they actually forewent having children in that year because they did not want to have one of these unmanageable women for their daughters. Now, as I mentioned, this is a 60-year cycle. So the last year of the fire horse was 1966. And that means that this year, 2026, is once again year of the fire horse. And it will be interesting to see if this superstition still has any bearing on fertility rates. But I think that is no longer the case. However, the overarching thing that I want you to take away here is this, long period of below replacement fertility that in Japan has continued since the early 1970s. Um, we can also look at Japan in international comparison with respect to these fertility rates. Um, and Japan here is the orange line. So we can see this precipitous decline in the 1950s that I was just describing, and then this kind of low level of fertility in Japan for a long time. And what makes Japan unusual today is not that it has a low level of fertility, because many countries actually do, but that it fell at such an early time period. So what this means is that Japan is kind of a forerunner of what other countries are going to be experiencing a few decades down the line in terms of population decline. All right, so what does that look like? Here we have Japan's long run population. I mean, really long run, because these data go all the way back to the year 1000. I did not make these data up. They come from the Japanese government. I'm not really sure about the reliability of these statistics prior to the modern era, but this is something that the government has put out. And we can see, when Japan enters the modern era and it experiences exponential population growth, but because we've now had below replacement birth rates for over 50 years at this point, that population growth has leveled off, and it's even begun to decline a little bit. But this is what's projected to happen over the course of the next 100 years. Essentially, all of that population growth is projected to be wiped out because Japan has been in this cycle of below replacement birth rates for so long. And if you make a similar graph for other countries, Europe, the United States, maybe the pace of this decline is a little bit less steep, but you would see basically a very similar pattern. All right. So this is something that the Japanese government has been concerned about for a very long time, wanting to reverse this trend. So I have here something that former Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi said about it. In the early 2000s, he said we must reverse the trend of the declining birth rate. And he wasn't the first prime minister to make statements about this. There was already an awareness of this issue or concern about it for at least the decade before this. But the sense of kind of crisis about it has only intensified in the 20 years since Koizumi. So Prime Minister Shinzo Abe characterized the problem as even more severe. He said, "This is our greatest challenge. This is actually a national crisis. We really need to do something to deal with this." And subsequent prime ministers have taken a similar stance. So Fumio Kishida said he was perhaps even more apocalyptic in how he talked about that. He said Japan is on the brink of not being able to function as a society due to low birth rates. And now we have Takaichi. And interestingly, I think she's a little bit less apocalyptic in her statements than maybe Kishida or Abe were. But she recently said the low birth rate is a very serious situation. Population decline is a quiet emergency. But that's a little bit different from saying, we're on the brink of not being able to function as a society. And I think this maybe speaks to the fact that she, or perhaps some of the constituencies that she wants to attract, are a little bit uncomfortable with the ways that the government has responded to this crisis to date, which I will tell you a little bit about now. Okay, so what have some of the major policy responses to this been? And this is not a comprehensive list. This is just some that I have picked out that I think are particularly important. So beginning in the 1990s, the government began to reduce the costs of childcare and education. They've made maternity or parental leave longer and more generous in terms of pay replacement, also beginning in the 1990s. They've made a concerted effort to increase daycare spots, and that this also began in the 1990s but really intensified in the 2010s. Efforts to improve career opportunities for women beginning in the 2000s, also intensifying in the 2010s. And then perhaps most recently, efforts to reduce work hours and encourage men to take parental leave and generally be more involved in household labor beginning in the 2010s. So, what have some of the effects of these policies been? Well, for one thing, the policies in the beginning only implicitly, but more recently explicitly, they have been promoting a sort of evolution away from the salaryman, housewife, household model. And looking at how this was first done implicitly, we see Prime Minister Abe here. This is 2014. And he's promising that he's going to make a society where all women can shine. That's pretty ambiguous wording. Like, how are you going to shine? What is that going to entail? He's not saying, I'm going to, create gender equality or something like that. But he's clearly saying he's going to change gender roles in some way, but not explicitly. Or if we look at more recent output by the government on this topic, this idea that we're moving away from the salaryman, housewife, household model is much more explicit. So this is from a graphic by the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare, and they have an initiative called the Tomoiku Project. And Tomoiku literally means like raising together. And the tagline for this is no more single operator at work or in the home. So the idea that men are responsible for paid work, women are responsible for the household, saying we're going to move away from that quite explicitly. And I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about that initiative in particular if people have questions. All right. So let's get into some of the specifics of what these policies have entailed. Well, one thing is that Japan has really increased the generosity of its parental leave. It now offers up to 14 months of paid leave for anyone in regular employment. You get 66% salary replacement for the first 6 months, and with various tax breaks, it probably ends up being more like 80 or 85% of your salary. And then 50% of your salary thereafter. So in international comparison, Japan is one of the most generous countries in terms of the parental leave that it supplies. And of course, the US is one of the least generous, down here at the bottom with 0 weeks of paid leave entitlement. All right. Daycare is another area where the Japanese government has made huge investments. There's been a big increase. This is just the number of slots that are available in daycare facilities in Japan between 2013 and 2025. And particularly during the Abe administration, there's a very rapid increase in this. And the result of this is that the number of children whose parents want to put them into daycare but aren't able to because there isn't a slot has fell precipitously beginning in the late 2010s. So 2017 was the peak of children who were waitlisted, 26,000 children across Japan, and that had been cut to less than a tenth by the final year here, 2025, just 2,254 kids waiting. So one result of, not just both of these policies, but other policies as well, is that women's labor force participation in Japan has increased pretty rapidly over the past 10 or 15 years. So if we look back to 1990, the percentage of women in Japan, age 15 through 64, was around 57% or so, and that was much lower than female labor force participation in the United States. But the US over the past 35 years has just seen these kind of up and down fluctuations within a fairly narrow band, while Japan has steadily increased throughout that entire period, surpassing the United States for these age groups, at least in 2014, and continuing to grow since then, so that now approximately 3 in 4 women in these age groups are in the labor market. So actually, when people talk about returning to traditional gender roles, in some way this is more traditional, looking back to the 1880s and before, than this kind of brief intervening period from the 1950s to the 1980s or so, when salaryman, housewife households were more common. Another big change has been an encouragement of men to take parental leave as well as women. And this is directly motivated by the idea that if men take parental leave from the time that their children are little, they will be more involved in household labor. They will be more involved in child rearing for the length of that child's life. And the hope is that this will make women more willing to have more children. So we can see that men's parental leave uptake was very low in the 2010s, but beginning around 2020 or so, it increased more rapidly, such that in the most recent year for which data are available, which is 2024, 40.5% of eligible men took a parental leave. So it's still much lower than the parental leave rate for women. And the length of leave that men tend to take is still much shorter than women. Women usually take about a year. Men may take only a week or so, or just a few days. But there has been this rapid change. It used to be that men took no leave whatsoever. So these have been some pretty big shifts in people's behavior that are quite visible in this sort of large-scale data. All right. Now, because I don't have a lot of time, I'll just draw some brief conclusions for this. So one thing is that the government has explicitly been promoting and facilitating paid work for women and household labor for men. And the motivation behind this is not that every Japanese prime minister really wants both the household and the workplace to become more gender equal. The motivation really is we think that doing this will increase the birth rate. And the logic behind that is if women are working more, families' economic situation will be more stable and they'll be willing to have more children. And if men are participating more in household labor, the burden of that household labor is shared, it's less heavy, and once again, households will be willing to have more children. So it's not that, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe really loves gender inequality, but he did have this strong sense of crisis about the birth rate that inspired him to sort of put in place many policies that facilitated gender equality in the workplace and the household, even if that wasn't his ultimate aim. So the government has moved away from what people like to think of as this traditional household, but I also want to emphasize that it's incorrect to refer to these salaryman housewife households as traditional, because these type of households were common only during a relatively short period of Japan's history. And we can actually see that very clearly in household statistics put out by the Japanese government. So this is just the numbers of different types of households, limiting it only to married couples who are below retirement age. And the housewife households, that is where the husband is working for pay and the wife is not, we can see that they have been declining since 1980. Even in the early 1990s, they were about even with dual earner households. There wasn't much change between 1990 and 2000, but in the 21st century, there's been this rapid increase in dual earner households and a decline in housewife households. So, this model was never had very deep roots in Japan's history, and it's also become a rather small minority of all households in recent decades. Some other points I would like to make is that, as I hope you can see from these statistics, Japanese society is undergoing some, I think, quite a rapid change in people's gender roles, both in the workplace and in the household. But you wouldn't necessarily know that from English language media, because the stories all tend to focus on Japan as traditional or backwards or pointing to problems. And I don't want to say that such problems don't exist, but I think that the tone of this coverage tends to obscure some of the very real changes that have occurred in recent decades. That said, I think it's very clear that women's behavior and attitudes towards gender roles have changed significantly more than men's. And one example of that is that we've seen this rapid increase in female labor force participation. So women are in the paid workplace much more than in prior decades. But men have not sort of stepped into the household sphere to the extent that women have stepped into the workplace. And one way that that is sort of tension or that uneven pace of a change has become obvious in recent weeks is with the World Cup. And so Japanese soccer fans in the US have been receiving this very positive coverage for cleaning up the stadium after the game is over. And this kind of became a trend on Japanese Twitter/X of women criticizing this, saying, it's all very nice that you go out and do that at the soccer game, but you're not really making that same contribution at home, and we would like you to be doing so. And this is also, this is just kind of a silly internet meme, but it's also very much reflected in time use statistics, where you can see that women are still spending a very high number of minutes on household labor, and men's minutes, while they are increasing slowly, remain quite low in international comparison. And then, of course, there's the question of the birth rate, right? So there have been all of these government policies that are acting on gender equality, but their ultimate goal is really to increase the birth rate, right? It's like, if we have more gender equality, we'll get more births, and that will solve this population crisis that we have. And the birth rate hasn't risen. So is it fair to say that the policies have failed in their intended aims? Well, I think that that's very difficult. That's a very difficult question to answer, because we don't know what Japan would have been like in the absence of these policies, right? And actually, if we compare fertility in Japan to some of its other East Asian neighbors, fertility rates have fallen much less than they have in some of these other countries. So this is just comparing fertility rates in 2020 versus 1990. Of course, in 1990, Japan already had a very low fertility rate, but it hasn't fallen that much since then. Whereas if we look at China, there's been a really big drop. Most of these other countries, there's been a bigger drop, and their fertility rates are now well below that of Japan, with South Korea being kind of noticeable for its particularly low levels of fertility, below even one child per woman. So one possible interpretation is that if Japan had not begun implementing all of these policies in the 1990s, it would look more like South Korea today and be in a even more severe situation with regard to population decline. However, this is admittedly all very speculative, and I think that no one really knows. No country has successfully raised its birth rates back to replacement rate, and so ultimately, I think this will remain politically contested, whether this is the kind of correct path for Japan to be on if it wishes to raise birth rates. So I will stop there and I look forward to your questions.
Awesome. We've got quite a few questions coming in the chat. Really, really great. I love to see it. We're still pulling those in, so there is still time to add to the questions. However, we do have a lot to start with, so that's lovely. I just had one. I wanted to ask myself, when you were showing the labor force drop-off rates during childbearing years, if you will, and then women re-entering the work place afterwards later, I was curious when women were or are nowadays as well dropping out of the labor force and then coming back in, are they re-entering into the same fields and jobs that they had prior to having children, or does it mark a dramatic shift in the work that they re-enter into?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great question. So if you look back as recently as like the 2015 and the before, the answer is women are not re-entering into the same type of jobs. So women would be regular employees in their early 20s. Then they would leave and they would come back as irregular employees later. But that trend has also really turned around since 2014 or so. Now that parental leave has become much more accessible and generous, women in regular employment are, taking a parental leave and then actually coming back to their same companies. Now, does the company necessarily treat them the same after they come back? That's a little bit of a separate question. But they are at least able to maintain regular employment to a far higher degree in the past. It used to be that almost all women who held regular employment at one point would leave it. And that trend has completely reversed. Most women who have regular employment now retain that status through the childbearing years.
That's good to know. That's good to know. Yeah, shifting trends. We're gonna continue on. I have more, but I'm gonna go to the audience questions first. Then I might come back to a question for myself and Amani. But so one of the I'll kind of go in a little bit in order to reward people for asking early. We had a question from Amit Newfield, and he asked any ideas why Japanese women, and I'll add parentheses families have very little interest in having more than one child. No, I know we talked a lot about the birth rate, but you want to know like any ideas why they're choosing to have so few children, even though we know that we're well below the birth rates.
Yeah. So I think that in general for women, the idea that you should have children to like save the country or support the birth rate is an extremely unmotivating
Mm,
narrative. That said, the main reason why the birth rate is low is not because couples are having only one child. It's because fewer couples are getting married at all. So Japan is unusual compared to countries of Western Europe or the United States, where there's quite a lot of childbearing outside of marriage. And in Japan, there's almost none, like less than 2% of births are outside of marriage. But when people get married, they are still, for the most part, having two children. And this is also different from South Korea, where people get married and then they only have one child. So, where is the fall off coming from? It's coming from people mostly not having more than two children or people not getting married in the first place.
that's really interesting. We actually had Akiko Fuji in the chat who mirrored that exact image. She was saying, as a Japanese woman, she believes that Japan's low birth rate is not primarily due to lack of institutional support, but it's driven by the rise in unmarried rate. So, consensus seems to be around that. Very, very nice. Very
Yeah,
good.
so if I can just speak to
Of
that
course.
point, I think that um, encouraging marriage is obviously a possible policy solution to this. But there's fewer levers, I think, that the government has to do that compared to encouraging people who are already married to have children. So you are seeing a rise of like local governments creating matchmaking events. or local governments maybe subsidizing the use of dating apps for people that live there. Uh, but it's very hard to sort of push people or give people incentives to get married in a way that doesn't feel kind of like icky and coercive. Um, so I think this is something that the government is really struggling with. If we know this, right? We know that most of the decline in the fertility rate is lack of marriage. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, there was a bit of discussion in the chat about this idea, and you mentioned irregular jobs and irregular jobs, and reasons for. So people in the chat have been discussing maybe reasons why they think potentially people aren't getting married, and a few people have talked about the things about if you have the irregular jobs, maybe you feel you can't afford to get married, or maybe as a man, I think some people feel that they would not be a good prospective partner because they don't make enough money. And just quite a bit of chat in and around there.
Okay,
So
well,
so it
can
goes
I
quite
can
a
I
bit.
comment on
Yes.
that point? I'm not reading through the chat, but
Yeah, of
I
course.
do have some data that I would like to share about that, which is that I think this narrative that this is about the rise of irregular employment, that kind of emerged during the Koizumi era. But employment trends have really shifted, especially since 2014 when Japan entered a labor shortage. So, actually, a higher percentage of people in their late 20s are in regular jobs than at any point in Japan's history. So, I think that this is about irregular employment. Certainly, it's true that people who have irregular jobs, especially men, are maybe not perceived by themselves as
Mhm.
others as like really great marriageable prospects. But that's a relatively small number of people relative to the whole population of young Japanese men. So that's not what's driving this trend.
Great comments. Thank you very much. It's good to get that data coming from our rough ideas as laymen. So we had another question regarding these issues from Gil. He was asking about Japan's social safety net and asking what's Japan's social safety net like, and how does that seem to impact or otherwise influence population growth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Japan's safety net has, in the entire post-war period, it's been kind of tied to work. Um, and if you are in regular employment, often your company will provide some type of pension. Certainly, there's public pension as well. Um, but it's relatively skimpy and not necessarily enough to live on in your old age. So historically there has been this kind of inequality between people who have jobs at large wealthy companies that can afford to provide a generous pension versus those who do not, irregular workers and people at smaller companies. Um, I do think that people may have regular jobs, but just be worried about the future, and they don't have the sort of sense of security that like people in Nordic countries have, that if I become unemployed, the government is going to take care of me and nothing too bad is going to happen to me. I think people in Japan do lack that sense of security. So regardless of whether or not their assessments about their employment security are correct, they may well not be. But just having this sense of I don't know what the future holds, I'm anxious about the future, I think also discourages people from getting married and having children.
Mm, that's a very good point. Yeah, I know. Even for myself, I'm like, oh, I better have some kids soon. But I always think, oh, but it's a good time. I don't know. So maybe I overthink that as well. We have a ton of questions. So I'm trying to get to all of them. A little bit of it's a bit of a change in a little bit of a shift, but it is interesting because so William Downey asks, Japan is often influenced by changes in American society, or at least we feel that way. Do you see the current trend in the United States that seems to be reversing advances made towards gender equality, negatively influencing Japan potentially?
Yeah, so this is a question that I am also very interested in. But I think one big difference between Japan and the United States is that Japan tends to change more slowly than the United States does. So it's almost like too early to say if there will be the same backlash against gender equality in Japan that we're seeing in the United States. I think there are some sort of inklings of that right now. So I said, I think Takaichi sounds a little bit different when she's talking about the birth rate than some of her immediate predecessors. Excuse me. And if you ask like what she proposes to solve this, I don't think she's saying we need to eliminate the programs that exist. But one thing that she talks about is we need to make sure that young people have decent wages. We need to increase wages for young people. And I think when she's saying that, she's really she's not saying this explicitly, but I think what she means is we need to increase wages for men,
Mm,
young men, so that we can, excuse me, so that this idea of like the household wage,
mm.
where a man could maybe support a family without his wife working. Like I think there's some nostalgia for that in some parts of the Japanese population,
Yeah.
and that is an important part of Takaichi's support base.
I do
Um,
recall Takaichi mentioning something along this, trying to go back to that like man running the job and a woman being the housewife type of idea, right?
Yeah, and this is also a talking point of the Sanseito, the
Mm,
far right party, and I think those sort of far right ideas being more incorporated into the mainstream through the Takaichi prime ministership, that is a real phenomenon. Um, that said, uh, I don't know like how popular that is with the broader public, and I also don't think that Takaichi really has an appetite for like undoing some of these programs that have become very popular, right? Like the
yeah.
parental leave and increased support for daycare, increased support for young families, and so on. So I think there might be some like slight convergence towards the United States, but I don't think we're going to see a drastic shift.
Mm, very good. We'll keep these things coming. So I've got some very technical question here. So Bronwyn Davis asked several questions in the chat. Very, very good questions. She brought up the M curve, which I know you shared. And the M curve we discussed being the female labor force participation rate plotted by age, I believe. And she was curious, how does the M curve in Japan impact women's fertility?
Mm. Yeah, so the M curve is really smoothed out. Like you can't even call it an M curve. I could have included a slide on contemporary labor force participation for women by age, um, but in the past 20 years, the M curve has vanished
Oh,
essentially. Um, how does that affect women's fertility? Well, the trope about the Japanese workplace is that it forces a binary choice on women. Either they have to, historically, they have to drop out when they have children, or if they want to stay in, they have to kind of adhere to very demanding work culture. So what that means is, yeah, you can stay in, but that means that you're not going to have children. Or you can leave, in which case you're kind of foregoing the chance for an upwardly mobile or stable career going forward. Um, I think what is changing is that there's a higher percentage of women who are looking at that choice and saying, yeah, you know what, I am going to forego having children because I will have more financial stability if I can support myself. Um, and Takaichi is actually an example of that type, and I think that there's a lot more Takaichis than there used to be. That said, what with all this parental leave, there is a smaller but growing number of women who say, I'm going to have a child and I'm going to try and stick with my upwardly mobile career. And that remains very difficult to do. But so like I said, the number of women who do so is small, but it's growing, and they're doing so in part with support from their husbands in the household, which is also changing as we've discussed, and also I think services like babysitters and so on, which in the United States is totally normal to use paid caregivers for your children outside of institutions. Japan, that hasn't been the case, but I think that is also changing.
I'm gonna bring back up to a question that I got from Amani, so I want to get some of hers as I know she is a fresh mother, relatively fresh mother. She had a few questions. I'm gonna pick one of her questions, which was for Japanese mothers who only have one child, do they traditionally have a village of extended family to help raise their children? If they do not, do you think they would be more inclined to have more children if they had that?
Yeah, I think the village phenomenon is kind of rare in Japan. And it's especially rare among the type of people who go and work for large companies in Tokyo, for example. It's more common in rural areas, regional cities, where if you live close to your parents, often they will provide some sort of childcare support. But there's a lot of geographic unevenness in terms of who has access to that.
I see. Yeah, it's interesting. I think geographics is very interesting. Jenna brought up a thing about where she lives. She sees a lot of children. I go down to visit my friend down in Shonan area by the beach, and there's just tons of families with three kids each and four kids. And you'd go down there and you would not even imagine there's a there's a child birth rate issue. But Jenna had a very interesting. So where she lives in Yokohama, she said that it has lots of kids, but it also has lots of foreigners. And she was curious, how do immigrant gender roles and birth rates compare to native Japanese citizens?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Actually, my friend and colleague Tristan Ivory at Cornell has some research on that. And what they found was that when foreign women marry Japanese men, they kind of tend to converge to the Japanese gender roles of women becoming like a little bit more likely to drop out of the labor market when they have children. In terms of couples where two foreigners are married to each other, I think it's a bit more heterogeneous. More both partners are more likely to continue working, and in part that has to do, I think, with Japan's visa policy that uh,
Mm,
you can maintain a more favorable visa status if you're working. So you're kind of incentivized to do that under Japan's visa policy.
that's a very good point. Um, we have so many interesting questions. So th we're picking your brain on a lot of stuff here. We have one talking about after divorce, Japan has a very low rate of financial support of the children by estranged fathers, apparently. Obviously not good to hear. How does that impact Japanese women's thinking about and planning of births? Is that a factor that people are
Mm,
thinking of?
mm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So Japan's divorce rate is neither low nor high in international comparison, and it is true that until very recently, Japan did not have any form of joint custody. So children almost always live with the mother after divorce. Contact with their father might be entirely cut off, including any sort of financial support. So single parent households headed by women are one of the groups with the highest poverty rates in Japan. And it's not a huge number. I think that most divorces in Japan actually take place either among couples whose children have grown or between couples who haven't had children yet. So I think what people who feel like they might be headed towards divorce less likely to have children,
Mm,
um, or people who have children um, then become less likely to get divorced, even if their marriage isn't great. So I see the effects running more in that direction rather than sort of thinking like, oh, I'm not going to get married because what will happen if I get divorced with children or something like that.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I do think even in the States, they always say like, oh, if you have a kid, it kind of you stay together for the kid and things like that,
Yeah.
right? Um, so we had a few questions. I'm going to combine. So there was a question about dual earner households becoming more common in Japan, how that's affected parents' ability to balance work responsibility with childcare. Actually, I was curious, seeing because I watch with my own friend's family. Since COVID, he was able, the husband was able to work from home, and the wife's work, she often does. She teaches piano and things like that, so she can work in and out. It's very flexible. But I noticed when he shifted to the work from home, the combination of like everyone helping out each other seems to have been much more common, and like his expectations of what he does around the house is quite equivalent. Both parents have equivalency, and it's prevented, now it's like, well, now we're never going back to the way it was before because we see how it can be, and they seem quite happy with this. So I'm curious, with dual earner households, has this been causing a shift in making it more regular for gender roles to be more equal during the house, as well as things like with COVID and working from home? And then we also had a question about gender segregation in the workforce, again, going with women and men both in the workforce. To what extent does gender segregation in the workforce still exist today in terms of what
Mm-hmm.
jobs women can do versus men and things like that?
Yeah. So, with regard to the first question of dual earner households, I think the sort of standard expectation is even if you're in a dual earner household, the a wife's income tends to be considered kind of secondary to the man. Like in most cases, the man is still earning more. So, just by the fact that you're in a dual earner household does not necessarily mean that the household um, responsibilities will become more balanced. And I study large companies a lot, and one phenomenon that I observe in the large companies among people that are married is that the men, many of them have a wife who works part time,
Mhm.
and the women, many of them are single, or if they're married, their husband is working full time, and often he's working as long hours as they are or longer. So that does create kind of a structural disadvantage for women in the workplace that men are some freed in many cases to like fully devote themselves to the company,
Mm.
whereas women even working in the same companies are not because they still have to take on more at the home front. So I think that kind of remains the default, even though if that doesn't describe every couple, and people who manage to balance it more equally, like those type of couples are increasing as well. And then you asked about gender segregation.
Yes, segregation
Um,
in the workplace. You're what you were just saying makes me even more curious. Like, are we seeing women being less likely to get promoted because the idea is like
mhm.
they are not the main breadwinner, the man is. So is that still happening? Or jobs? Like I remember reading about, years ago, the universities, the medical universities were having an issue where they were fiddling with the entrance rates of women who
Yeah.
were actually doing better than men in the entrance exams, but were being admitted less in less numbers because the idea of amongst them was like, well, if women become doctors, they're gonna leave because they want to have babies soon anyway, and they're making decisions on what they feel women will will do. Is that still happening?
Yes. I definitely hear stories from the women who work in the companies that I study of, in some cases, explicitly being told,
Mm.
we are sort of reserving this position for a man who's supporting a family.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think that that's everyone. I think companies are trying to sort of restrain that tendency, but does it still occur? Yes, absolutely, it does. You see the same phenomenon in politics, actually. I think there's a lot of scrutiny of Japan has a really relatively low rate of women in parliament. And if you look at what the political parties are actually doing, they are fielding more women candidates, but they're putting them in districts that are hard to win because it's
Mhm.
like this district is an easy one to win, and we're going to reserve that for a man whose career we really want to advance. Um, so I think these sort of subtle occurrences happen, and not everyone experiences them, or not everyone experiences them all the time, but in aggregate they do create inequalities between men and women.
There's still a lot of progress to be made, it sounds like. We are out of time. Did you have any final words or any comments or anything that came to your mind that you wanted to touch upon before we head out?
uh, no, I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we really have. Thank you so much for spending so much of your morning with us, or your evening, 3 in the morning, excuse me. So technically, it is your morning. Really, we do appreciate it. And thank you to everyone in the audience who also came out for today's talk. Thank you again to our wonderful speaker. I've heard her speak in person. Now I've been able to see her speak online, and I thoroughly enjoyed both of them. So thank you so much, Professor Holbrow. We really, really appreciate that, and we'd love to have you back again in the future.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and thanks, Imani, for hosting me.
Great,
Thanks,
awesome. Everyone have a
everybody.
beautiful day.
Bye bye.
FadTech's IT support and mobile internet service helps make events like this one possible. Thank you.